The chandeliers of Ravenshire House shimmered like captive constellations above the ballroom, their crystal tiers trembling in the warmth of 100 candles. Silk skirts whispered across polished floors as violins coaxed noble guests into graceful turns beneath painted ceilings where cherubs watched with permanent delight. Laughter floated lightly, perfumed with champagne and quiet cruelty, for society rarely gathered without bringing both admiration and appetite. At the center of this brilliance stood Lady Eleanor Whitcombe, Duchess of Ravenshire by marriage, her gloved hands folded with habitual composure while conversations curved politely around her as though she were an elegant obstruction in a well-decorated room. She had learned, in the short months since her wedding, how to occupy space without disturbing it. Her beauty was the quiet kind that revealed itself only to those patient enough to notice: thoughtful gray eyes, a gentle mouth inclined toward kindness, and chestnut hair arranged with modest precision. Yet patience was a virtue seldom practiced in ballrooms, where brilliance shouted and subtlety starved. The Duke, her husband, had not sought a companion of depth, but a duchess of convenience. Alexander Ravenshire stood across the room surrounded by admirers, tall and composed in black evening attire that sharpened his already commanding presence. His smile came easily to others, yet rarely reached the corners of his eyes when turned toward his wife. Near him stood Miss Arabella Vane, radiant in scarlet silk, her laughter bright as struck glass and twice as cutting. Their familiarity hummed between them like a private melody played too loudly for discretion. Eleanor watched only briefly before lowering her gaze, for she had grown accustomed to the small humiliations that arrived disguised as normalcy. A passing duchess remarked upon the Duke's charm without acknowledging Eleanor's presence. Another guest praised Arabella's wit within deliberate earshot. Each word landed softly, but accumulated with the weight of falling ash. When the final waltz began, Eleanor realized she had not seen her husband approach her once that evening. The music swelled, couples rotated, and candlelight blurred into a golden haze. She excused herself with quiet grace and stepped into the corridor beyond the ballroom, seeking air unperfumed by pretense. The hallway was dim, lit only by wall sconces and the distant echo of music fading behind her. As she passed the library door, she heard laughter, low, intimate, unmistakably familiar. Eleanor paused, not from suspicion but from recognition. Arabella's voice drifted through the partially open door. "Does she never tire of looking so solemn?" she asked, amusement threading every syllable. The Duke replied with a soft chuckle Eleanor had once mistaken for kindness. "She is harmless," he said. "Like furniture one forgets is in the room." Their laughter overlapped, careless and unguarded. Eleanor did not gasp. She did not move. Something inside her simply stilled, as though the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe again. The words did not wound loudly, they settled quietly into places already bruised by neglect. The clock somewhere in the house began to strike midnight, each toll deliberate and echoing. Eleanor turned away before the final chime, her footsteps soundless against the carpet as she returned to her chambers without encountering a single soul. She removed her gloves, then her earrings, placing them neatly upon the vanity as though preparing for an ordinary night's rest. Her reflection regarded her with unfamiliar clarity. Furniture, she thought, does not walk away. She did not pack a trunk. She did not summon a maid. Eleanor dressed again in her traveling cloak and bonnet with calm, deliberate movements that surprised even her. From a drawer she took a small purse of coins and nothing more. The house slept as she descended the staircase before dawn. Shadows clung to portraits and banisters alike, unwilling witnesses to her quiet departure. She paused only once at the great doors, listening to the silence she had inhabited for months. When Eleanor stepped outside, the sky was paling with the first suggestion of morning. Cold air greeted her like honest company. She walked down the gravel path without looking back at the towering house that had never truly seen her. Upstairs, hours later, the Duke stirred from sleep with a vague discomfort he could not name. Sunlight filtered through curtains onto an untouched side of the bed. He reached across the sheets and found only cool emptiness where his wife should have been. He called for a servant with mild irritation, expecting explanation to arrive promptly. Instead, confusion entered the room before any answer did. The maids had not seen the Duchess since the ball. Her bed had not been slept in. Only when he noticed the absence of her wedding ring upon the vanity did unease press more firmly against his composure. Beside it lay a single pressed flower he had once handed her absent-mindedly in a garden months ago, now preserved with inexplicable care. For the first time since their marriage, Alexander Ravenshire felt the faint, disquieting sensation that something in his grand, orderly world had shifted beyond his control. The house seemed larger, quieter, and curiously accusatory. And as morning bells rang across the distant fields, the Duke understood with slow, dawning clarity that the woman he had dismissed as furniture had risen before dawn and quietly removed herself from his life. He stood motionless, listening to the echo of absence settle into the corners of the chamber like dust disturbed by light. Memory, unwelcome and persistent, began arranging small scenes he had long ignored. Her patient attentiveness at dinners, her quiet presence in gardens, the way she listened when he spoke without waiting to be noticed. None of these recollections accused him outright, yet together they formed a question he could not easily silence. Where had she gone, and why did the answer feel heavier than pride? Outside, servants hurried along corridors with rising alarm, while the estate awakened to whispers that would soon outrun discretion. The Duke turned toward the window, unaware unease was becoming dangerous. Morning arrived at Ravenshire House without its customary confidence, as though the sunlight itself hesitated to enter rooms that had failed to notice an absence until it became impossible to ignore. The servants moved through corridors with hushed urgency, their whispers slipping beneath doors like draughts of cold air. No one spoke the Duchess's name aloud, yet it hovered everywhere, unsettling the orderly rhythm of morning duties. Footmen paused mid-step, maids exchanged troubled glances, and even the housekeeper lost count of her keys. Something had shifted during the night, leaving the vast estate feeling curiously uninhabited, despite its many occupants. The Duke issued instructions with crisp authority, but the precision of his voice could not disguise the distraction tightening behind it. Riders were dispatched along 3 roads before breakfast, each given sealed directions to inquire discreetly at coaching inns and village crossings. No scandal must attach itself to her departure. No suggestion of discord must escape the estate walls. Yet even as he spoke these commands, Alexander felt the futility of them. Eleanor had left without trunks, without escort, without spectacle. She had not fled in panic, but in decision. In her chambers, the quiet remained untouched. Her wardrobe stood orderly, gowns arranged with care, gloves folded in their drawer. Nothing appeared disturbed except for the space she once occupied. The Duke stood there longer than he intended, noticing small details that had previously escaped his regard. The way she arranged fresh flowers beside the mirror, the embroidery frame resting near the window, the faint scent of lavender that lingered in the air. These were not grand impressions but gentle traces, and together they made the room feel less like a chamber and more like evidence. His gaze returned again to the vanity where her wedding ring lay beside the pressed flower. He picked it up for the first time, surprised by how light it felt in his palm. He remembered handing her that flower absent-mindedly during a summer walk, never imagining she would preserve it as something worth keeping. The realization unsettled him more than her disappearance. Eleanor, it seemed, had been treasuring moments he had never thought to notice. By noon, whispers had escaped beyond the estate gates. A visiting baroness sent a polite inquiry regarding the Duchess's health. A distant cousin wrote requesting reassurance that all was well. The Duke recognized the pattern with immediate irritation. Society did not require facts to form conclusions. It required only silence. And silence he now possessed in abundance. Miss Arabella Vane arrived unannounced that afternoon, her carriage wheels scattering gravel across the courtyard with confident impatience. She entered the drawing-room dressed impeccably, her expression poised between curiosity and annoyance. "Surely this cannot be as dramatic as the servants imply," she said lightly. "Women are prone to melancholy whims." The Duke did not answer at once. He found that her voice, once lively and welcome, now grated against a restlessness he could not name. Arabella watched him carefully. "You look troubled, Alexander. You cannot possibly blame yourself for a woman's fragile temperament." He turned toward the window instead of toward her. The garden outside appeared unusually still, the roses unmoving in the heavy air. For the first time, he wondered whether Eleanor had often stood there alone while he entertained others. The thought intruded without permission. That evening, a letter arrived from Lady Whitcombe, Eleanor's aunt, written in firm, elegant script. It contained no accusations, yet every line carried quiet reproach. She expressed concern for her niece's well-being and disappointment that such a gentle spirit might feel compelled to leave her husband's protection. The Duke read the letter twice, each reading tightening the pressure in his chest. Protection, he realized, could exist without kindness and kindness without display. Meanwhile, Eleanor traveled farther than anyone anticipated. After hours inside a modest carriage, she continued on foot along a coastal road lined with tall grass bending in the wind. The air smelled of salt and honesty. She felt neither panic nor triumph, only a gradual lightness, as though invisible weights were being lifted from her shoulders one by one. She rented a small room in a seaside village under her maiden name and slept without listening for footsteps in distant corridors. Back at Ravenshire, the Duke found himself wandering rooms he rarely entered. He paused in the conservatory where she had once spent an afternoon reading. He stood in the gallery where her portrait hung, noticing for the first time the patience in her painted expression. Everywhere he looked, Eleanor appeared in absence rather than presence, and the distinction unsettled him deeply. By the second morning, invitations meant for the Duke arrived with unusual delay. A dinner engagement was postponed. A luncheon politely cancelled. Society had begun adjusting its tone, subtly distancing itself from a household rumored to be fractured. Alexander recognized the quiet withdrawal with growing discomfort. Reputation, once effortless, now felt conditional. Late that afternoon, one of the dispatched riders returned, mud-streaked and breathless. He reported that a woman matching the Duchess's description had been seen traveling toward the southern coast before dawn. She had declined assistance and continued alone on the narrow road that led toward the sea. The Duke dismissed the man with a nod, but remained standing long after the door closed behind him. The sea. The word settled heavily in his thoughts. He pictured Eleanor walking beside unfamiliar waters, her cloak pulled close against the wind, her expression calm in a way he had never truly studied. For the first time since her departure, a feeling sharper than irritation pierced his composure. It was not anger nor embarrassment, but the dawning awareness that she had stepped beyond his reach with quiet certainty. As evening fell, Ravenshire House felt larger than ever, its corridors echoing with a silence that no servant dared disturb. The Duke stood alone in the dim drawing room, the writer's words repeating in his mind. She had gone toward the sea, carrying nothing with her except the resolve he had failed to recognize. And for the first time, Alexander Ravenshire understood that finding his wife would require more than sending men on horseback. The road to the coast narrowed as though reluctant to accommodate a man accustomed to wide avenues and obedient gates. Alexander traveled without crest or escort, his dark coat dusted with the pale memory of miles, his thoughts pacing faster than his horse. The air changed gradually, carrying salt and the restless murmur of unseen waves, and with it came a quiet unease he could neither command nor dismiss. He had spent years mastering rooms with posture and voice. Now he approached a place where neither would matter. The village appeared without ceremony, cottages huddled against the wind, windows bright with simple life. Children paused in their play to watch him pass, their curiosity unburdened by deference. He dismounted before the modest inn and asked, with restrained politeness, whether a young woman traveling alone had taken lodging nearby. The innkeeper studied him, then nodded toward the narrow path that led to a small parish chapel overlooking the sea. "She reads to the children there in the afternoons," he said. "Speak softly. They listen." Alexander followed the path on foot. The chapel emerged from tall grass like a thought half remembered, its stone weathered by years of patient storms. Beyond it, the sea stretched gray and immense, folding into itself with tireless rhythm. He heard voices before he saw her, light, attentive, threaded with warmth. Eleanor sat upon a wooden bench outside the chapel door, a book open in her hands, 3 children gathered close at her knees. Her bonnet rested beside her, allowing the wind to lift strands of chestnut hair across her cheek. She looked different not in appearance, but in ease, as though the air here recognized her without effort. When she noticed him standing at the edge of the grass, her voice paused mid-sentence and the children turned to look. She dismissed them gently, promising the story would continue tomorrow. They ran off laughing, leaving silence between husband and wife that felt less hostile than careful. Eleanor rose slowly, smoothing her skirt with calm deliberation. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head with familiar courtesy. He removed his gloves before answering, uncertain why the gesture felt necessary. "Eleanor." Her name sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, as though he had not earned the right to say it simply. For a moment they regarded one another without accusation, yet without comfort. "I hope the journey was not unpleasant," she continued, her tone polite, almost conversational. The wind carried the scent of salt between them, and he realized she had grown accustomed to it. "You left without explanation," he replied, hearing the inadequacy of the words as soon as they escaped. She met his gaze steadily. "I believed the explanation had already been spoken." He understood at once, and the memory of that corridor returned with humiliating clarity. The laughter. The phrase, "furniture." It sounded smaller now, stripped of bravado and placed beside her quiet dignity. "I came to ask you to return," he said, the sentence formal and carefully shaped. Eleanor regarded him with thoughtful patience rather than surprise. To Ravenshire? She asked. Or to you? The distinction unsettled him. They walked along the narrow edge where grass surrendered to sand, the sea rolling beside them with persistent breath. Alexander spoke of the estate, of responsibilities, of how her absence had unsettled the household. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression attentive yet distant. When he finished, she folded her hands before her and said gently, "Your Grace, I have discovered I am not furniture after all." The words did not accuse, they clarified. He felt something inside him shift, not dramatically but with irreversible certainty. "I did not understand you," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "You did not attempt to," she replied, not unkindly. They continued walking until the chapel bells rang faintly behind them, signaling approaching evening. Clouds gathered low over the water, dimming the horizon into silver-gray thoughtfulness. Alexander realized he had never walked beside his wife without destination before. The simplicity of it felt strangely intimate. "I believed silence meant contentment," he said after a long pause. "I believed your gentleness required nothing from me." Eleanor turned toward him then, her eyes reflecting the muted sky. "Gentleness still feels, Alexander. It simply does so quietly." Her use of his name startled him more than reproach would have. For the first time, he saw her not as a composed presence within his life, but as a person who had been enduring it. The awareness humbled him with uncomfortable clarity. A sudden wind swept across the shore, carrying the first cold drops of rain. Within moments the sky opened, and the sea darkened under the weight of the storm. Eleanor gestured toward the chapel. "We should take shelter," she said calmly. They hurried back along the path as rain blurred the grass into trembling silver. Inside, the chapel smelled of stone and old wood. Candle stubs rested near the altar, and Eleanor lit two with practiced hands. The small flames threw gentle light across her face, revealing an expression neither guarded nor yielding. Rain struck the stained glass in persistent rhythm, isolating them from the world beyond. Alexander stood near the doorway, uncertain whether to approach or remain where he was. The distance between them felt measured not in steps, but in realizations. He understood, with growing clarity, that asking her to return would require more than authority. It would require acknowledgement he had never practiced. Eleanor sat upon the front pew, the candlelight warming her features into quiet radiance. She looked toward him with patient expectation, as though waiting not for apology but for truth. And as thunder rolled faintly over the sea, Alexander Ravenshire felt the unfamiliar weight of words he had never learned how to speak gathering steadily in his throat. Candlelight trembled against the chapel walls as rain stitched silver threads across the stained glass, enclosing them in a hush that felt almost sacred. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments. Eleanor remained seated upon the pew, her hands folded loosely in her lap, while Alexander stood several paces away as though uncertain whether proximity might shatter something fragile between them. The storm outside pressed its insistence upon the roof, yet inside there existed a stillness that demanded honesty rather than shelter. He moved forward at last, each step measured by thought rather than confidence. "I have spoken often in my life," he began quietly, but rarely with care. Eleanor's gaze did not waver. She seemed neither impatient nor forgiving, only attentive in a way that required him to continue without embellishment. "I mistook gentleness for absence," he said. "I believed that because you did not demand attention you did not require it. I was wrong." The admission settled between them like a fragile offering placed carefully upon an altar. Eleanor inhaled slowly, as though steadying herself against words she had waited long to hear. "You were not cruel in the ways society recognizes," she replied. "You were courteous, generous, respectable. But kindness without regard is a colder thing than insult." Her voice held no accusation, only clarity sharpened by reflection. Alexander removed the signet ring from his finger, the heavy emblem of his title catching candlelight as he turned it in his hand. He placed it upon the wooden ledge beside them with deliberate care. "I speak now not as a duke," he said, "but as a man who has discovered how poorly he has loved his wife." The gesture did not astonish Eleanor as he expected. Instead, it seemed to ease something in her expression, as though she had long wished to meet him without the barrier of rank standing between them. "I loved you quietly from the beginning," she confessed, the words emerging with calm bravery. "I believed patience might earn affection. When I heard you laugh at me, I understood patience had only made me invisible." Rain battered the windows harder, thunder murmuring across the distant sea like a reminder of forces beyond pride. Alexander felt the weight of her confession with sobering force. "I never saw how deeply you felt," he admitted. "I never asked." She looked down at her hands briefly before meeting his eyes again. "I do not require grand declarations, Alexander. I require to be seen." He stepped closer then, stopping just within the warmth of her candlelight. "I see you now," he said, his voice unsteady for the first time since she had known him. "And I am ashamed it took your absence to grant me sight." Silence followed, but it no longer felt strained. It felt contemplative, like soil turned gently before planting something new. Eleanor rose from the pew, standing before him with quiet dignity. The nearness revealed small details he had overlooked for months. The steadiness of her breathing, the strength behind her softness, the composure that had never been weakness but restraint. "If I return," she said carefully, "it cannot be to the life I left. I will not resume my place as an ornament within your household." Her eyes searched his face for understanding rather than permission. "You shall return as its heart," he replied without hesitation. "Not as furniture. Not as convenience. As my equal in all things that matter." The words felt unfamiliar on his tongue, yet undeniably true. Lightning flashed faintly through colored glass, illuminating them both in a brief wash of pale brilliance. Eleanor studied him with an intensity that seemed to measure sincerity rather than eloquence. "And Miss Vane?" she asked quietly. Alexander did not look away. "She will have no place in my life. That decision was made the moment I stood in your empty chamber and understood what I had lost." Eleanor absorbed this without visible triumph. Instead, a subtle relief softened her features, like tension released from a long-held breath. "You cannot undo what has passed," she said. "But you may choose what follows." "I choose you," he answered simply. The storm began to lessen, its fury dissolving into a gentle percussion upon the roof. Candle flames steadied, casting warmer light across the chapel's worn stone. Something within the small space felt changed, as though the air itself acknowledged the shift between them. Alexander extended his hand, not in command but in invitation. Eleanor regarded it for a moment that felt longer than the night itself. Then, with deliberate grace, she placed her hand in his. The contact was light, yet carried a weight of understanding neither of them had possessed before. They stood that way without speaking, listening to the fading rain and the distant hush of waves returning to calm. For the first time since their marriage, there existed no performance between them, no expectation shaped by society's gaze. Only two people bound by truth rather than arrangement. Dawn began to press pale light through the stained glass, softening colors into gentle pastels. Eleanor withdrew her hand slowly, though not reluctantly. "I will walk with you back to the village this morning," she said. "But my return to Ravenshire must be a decision made in daylight, not candlelight." Alexander nodded, accepting the condition without argument. He understood that trust would not be granted in a single night, no matter how honest his words had been. They stepped outside together into air washed clean by rain. The sea stretched calm and reflective beneath the awakening sky, its surface catching the first hints of gold. Eleanor paused on the chapel steps, looking toward the horizon with thoughtful stillness. Alexander watched her quietly, aware that the choice now rested not in his authority, but in her willingness. And as the sun began to rise over the water, casting long light across the path before them, he realized that this moment, simple, silent, and uncertain, held more consequence than any grand declaration he had ever made.